I decided to go and visit the location of the 5 death camps. I call them the death camps because 80% of the people there were wiped out because of starvation and diseases. When I went there, I saw the remaining of the camps. And then I looked at the cemeteries and the graves. We call them in Libya jababin or qubur. And it was long rows and lines of graves. I literally drove back to Benghazi and I was shaken because I saw death face to face. It wasn't something here academic or so. No, you see really the horrors of what happened there. And I got really angry at the Libyan modern state, the monarchy and the Gaddafi regime and Jamahiriya for talking big but doing so little.
There is a chilling quote that you include from General Badoglio. It's very explicit about creating a separation between the rebels and the civilian population. I'm going to read it if you don't mind. We must, above all, create a large and well-defined territorial gap between the rebels and the subject population. I do not conceal from myself the significance and the gravity of this action, which may well spell the ruin of the so-called subject population. So essentially, it wasn't coincidental. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew it could lead to mass deaths, and they still didn't care. Now, this policy led to forced marches, mass deportations, and concentration camps. Welcome to a new episode of Season 4 of the Rain Podcast with your host, Loin Larake, Professor of Political Science at the University of Richmond. Rain is a podcast dedicated to exploring new research and books in the social sciences and humanities through conversations with authors and scholars studying the Arab world and the Middle East. Starting this season, Rain becomes a bilingual podcast alternating between English and Arabic episodes. Rain is produced by Al Salon, an independent initiative dedicated to reviewing and discussing non-fiction books on the Arab world and the Middle East. Today's episode explores one of the least discussed chapters in the history of 20th century colonialism, the genocide carried out by Fascist Italy in eastern Libya between 1929 and 1934. In Genocide in Libya, Shar, a Hidden Colonial History, Ali Abdullatif Ahmida, examines Italy's campaign to crush anti-colonial resistance in Cyrenaica, during which tens of thousands of Libyans died through forced displacement, executions, starvation, and imprisonment in concentration camps. But this is more than a history of colonial violence. Ahmida asks why a genocide of this scale has remained largely absent from public memory. He explores how the destruction of evidence, the enduring myth of moderate Italian fascism, and the marginalization of Libyan voices helped obscure one of the 20th century's major colonial crimes. In this episode, we explore these questions and more with Dr. Ali Abdullatif Ahmida, political scientist, historian, and professor at the University of New England. Let us begin. Dr. Ahmida, it's great to have you on the podcast. Anren, welcome on our podcast. Before we dive into the book, I'd love to start with you. Could you tell us a bit about your background and your research? In particular, I want to understand what drew you to this topic and to Libya more broadly.
My background is a little bit complex. I was born in Libya and finished high school there. I got a scholarship to study in Cairo. I studied in a small liberal arts college called Faculty of Economics and Political Science at the University of Cairo. Very limited students, 150 I recall, or 200 students. And then after I finished there, my undergraduate degree, I came to the United States for graduate school, and I studied English in Seattle, Washington, in the northwest of the United States. And I met a very, very interesting professor, an Iranian Muslim professor there, who persuaded me to stay. So instead of a big Eastern school, I stayed in Seattle and I finished my master and PhD at the University of Washington. And that's really the larger background. What's unusual for me is instead of just studying political science and particularly African studies, I didn't study the Arab world or the Muslim world. I studied Africa and theory and comparative. I took two other fields. One is historical sociology and anthropology, which was a new field at the University of Washington. And also I specialized intensively in African history. So what happened is that I had multidisciplinary, if you like, background. And that, you know, most of my work, earlier work, my dissertation and most of my work has to do with the colonial period because of a family background. We could talk about it. That's really the bottom line for that. My both grandparents and my mother were born in exile. They were involved in the anti-colonial resistance, and I grew up listening to their stories. And instead of having a fancy political science topic, I decided to just examine the colonial period and its puzzles, its riddles, it's really unexplaining dilemmas and why people were invaded, how they reacted to the colonial period, why they reacted differently. And that really made me delve into that topic. And I'm a specialist on the anti-colonial resistance and colonialism in the Maghreb or North Africa since then. My book that you referred to, Luay, is really a third of a trilogy. The first one, which is based on my dissertation, the dissertation was basically, it's called For God, Homeland, and Clan, Social and Cultural and Economic Origins of Anti-Colonial Resistance. And the book was published under The Making of Modern Libya. That's the first one in 1994. And the second one, the second part of this trilogy is called Forgotten Voices, Power and Agency in Colonial and Post-Colonial Libya. And the third one is this book that you read, Genocide in Libya, Shar, A Hidden Colonial History. I did other works like Beyond Colonialism and Nationalism, Bridges Across the Sahara, the Libya We Don't Know, Post-Orientalism and Post-Colonialism. So you could tell that it's really based on that period, late 19th century, first half of the 20th century. But then after that, I began to expand my research to the post-colonial period, except that this topic was very, very troubling and vague and understudied, and almost kind of people forgot about it in Libya, and especially in most parts of Libya, except, of course, the east and the south, and in the Arab world. But also in Western scholarship, I discovered this case was completely erased. And therefore, I began my research in 2000, and it took me forever to finish it because it was so complex, so hard to decipher and find out the evidence. And it took almost 10 years of research and 5 years of verifying the evidence. And then after that, the writing and testing it. So it's a really a book that's the culmination of almost 20 years of research on the topic. And it surprised me because I came to this topic without really any expectations. And 80% of the material that I discovered was due to this research and this book.
So this is really interesting. So I want to ask you quickly, just briefly, tell me a little bit about your family background and how they fought in the resistance against, I'm assuming, the Italian colonists, because you're Libyan background.
Yes.
So tell me about that background and how it inspired you to dive into this topic.
Excellent question, Luay. Unfortunately, the Libyan colonial experience is not very well known. The only thing I think most Arabs and most Muslims remember are the movie Lion of the Desert about Omar al-Mukhtar, the legendary anti-colonial hero who died modest, dignified, and symbolized not only the anti-colonial resistance in Libya, but I think in the whole South in general. He looked a modest man, a Muslim with strong faith and strong convictions. But this is a really complicated issue. They don't know much about Libya. They know about Omar al-Mukhtar. They know about King Idris. They know about Gaddafi, oil. But really below that, our academic and even public knowledge is very, very kind of superficial and very, very limited. What people don't know that when the Italian state decided to invade Libya because most of North Africa was already taken by the French, Libya was the last province of the Ottoman Empire called Trablus al-Gharb. They liked it because it's the last, Ottoman state, Ottoman province. And also, when they invaded, they thought that they would have an easier time. Modern army, they had a propaganda about the fact that we are here to help Libyans who are backward and made really poor and impoverished and illiterate because of the Ottoman Empire mismanagement. But they faced a very, very stiff volunteer armies because the community was very well organized in either through the Senussia movement or the Tripolitanian Republic in the West, or people who were organized in confederations. My both grandparents, who are from the south, from central Libya, they volunteered in the armies. My grandfather, my father's side, Sharif Ahmida al-Saghir, was a faqih and also mujahid. And he participated in many of these movements. And also my grandfather, my mother's side, Ali Sanusi, fought until 1930. And then after that, both of them disappeared. One, when they were defeated by 1930, my grandfather, Ali Sanusi, with the resisting groups, escaped into a country called Chad in southern Libya. My mother was born there. My grandmother died and buried in Faya, Chad. And my grandfather, the other grandfather, Hamida, disappeared. They thought he was, killed. But then he was hid by other groups, by other tribes called the Magharba and Urfalla. And only 10 years after the defeat of the Italians, he reappeared. It was a very pleasant thing. For me, Lu'ay, I grew up as a youngster. I was born after independence. And my grandfather, my mother came to Libya after independence and the defeat of the Italian state. So I grew up in the 60s listening to stories, especially my grandfather, Ali Sanusi, and my mother. And I heard his story almost 20 or 30 times, as if he wanted to make sure to tell me that story. When I went to Egypt, that was with me. But the truth of the matter, I wanted to, as I chatted with you before the interview, it became a puzzle for me. I want to know where my family came from, why the people resisted, what happened during the resistance, how they survived, and how they managed this really facing a modern, brutal, violent army. And I think that I tried to link my academic education and research and scholarship to understand bigger questions. And it's not just a historian, because historians, they have their own focus. I come from a theoretical, comparative way of thinking about hard questions and try to synthesize and see the patterns, the institutions, the lessons, and also both the onslaught itself and how society adopted, either resisted, either withdraw, either collaborated, either negotiated, and link the social and the institutional and the cultural with also these patterns of understanding social transformation, and also why we look the way we look now. So it became kind of a new take, a new questions for all topics. And instead of the narrative of dates and heroes and names, I try to look at it theoretically, comparatively, and try to make a sense of it as a part of a larger Arab and African and Southern history, and contemporary debate in the social and political theories of post-colonialism.
I want to build on this idea of Libya, or of the particular massacre or genocide that took place as a hidden history, as you've mentioned multiple times now, right? So, the book talks about the hidden history of the Libyan genocide under Italian colonial rule between 1929 and 1934 in particular. You talked a little bit earlier, but that's the main focus. Now, one of the striking things is how deliberately obscured this history seems to have been. Can you walk us through that, and how did the Italian authorities, both at the time, at the colonial time and afterward, manage or suppress information about the genocide?
Two things. First, the Italian, before, as in Algeria, if you compare Libya with Tunisia and Morocco and Egypt, you are not going to understand it. Most Arabs, including academics, really haven't read anything like that. Libya is we should think of it like Algeria. It was designed as a settler colony, not an territorial colony like the Husseini state in Tunisia or the Alawite state in Morocco or the Muhammad Ali family. And so where you colonize the country and keep the elite, keep the state. In Libya, the Italian viewed Libya as the fourth shore, as extension of Italy, and therefore they wanted to resolve what they so-called demographic problem of mistreating their immigrants in Latin America and North America, and they have their own colony. And also they wanted to resolve the southern peasant question in Italy by, instead of having land reform, they export them as settlers in Libya. So that's what we need to understand. The second point, they faced a very, very well-organized, brilliant anti-colonial resistance, ideologically, institutionally, socially, of volunteer armies that deterred them and even almost defeated them in some battle until 1931. So that's really the background and this one. To crush this resistance, especially the fascists, after 1922 in Italy, and I found evidence in the archives, they decided that we're going to crush this resistance at any price because this is our colony. We want to settle our people there, and we are not going to let them, if it meant exterminating many of them, that's fine. So what they did, they applied that, strategic mindset. What they did, they put a fence, 300 miles fence between Libya and Egypt, and they came with the most draconian policy, which is to transfer the civilian population of Barqa, of eastern Libya, to the desert of Sirte by sea and by deporting them on foot with their 500,000 herds. Qut'an means camels, sheep, and horses, and everything. Now, why they did that? Because they realized, the generals and the military strategists of the fascist state, that the resistance, which, a small one, are really supported by the society. Society will send volunteers with arms, with food, with horses, with camels. And when they were killed, they replaced them with the new fighters, new resistors. And I think they came to the conclusion, if we want to crush the resistance, we want to really dry the colonial, dry the swamps. I mean, the society that supported them. So they came with a draconian policy. They want to deport and transfer the whole civilian population, 80% of it, from all of eastern Libya, Barqa, to the desert of Sirte, and put them either in 16 concentration camps. The worst were the 5 concentration camps from outside Benghazi until near Sirte. And I focus on those 5 ones, because why I focus on the 5 concentration camps? Because most of the death, 80% of the 110,000 people, including women, children, and elderly, and the 500,000 animals that sustained them, were really put in these 5 camps. That's really the larger picture. Now, you ask a good question, Lu'ay. Why we don't know about this? We know about Umar al-Mukhtar, but what's behind Umar al-Mukhtar? What happened to this really mass killing? And how come we don't know about it? First of all, when I investigated why people died, and only 35,000, 60 to 70,000 died in the camp. They died because what they called in Arabic, because of Shar. And for them, Shar meant 2 things. No food, starvation. They gave them a little bit of barley, sha'ir. And when they got ill, they didn't treat them. So they said, son, we died because of Shar. For them, collective death, starvation, and diseases in these big camps, concentration camps. Now, the final point that you asked me about, and need to be explained, how come nobody knows about that? The 2 things are important. The Italians succeeded in censoring that news, and it happened at a time where there was a Great Depression. News were Libya was sealed by the fascists. And also the other things that, unfortunately, the Western, at that time, colonialism and conquest was normalized and legitimized in the Western media. So what happened in Libya was only kept alive by exiled intellectuals and activists. Some are in Saudi Arabia, like Bashir al-Saudawi and Khalid al-Garni, and the active group in Damascus and in Cairo. That's it. After independence, after the end of fascism, why this case continued to be marginalized and completely erased from modern scholarship, there's an explanation for it. First, the Allies collaborated and habilitated the fascists as Badoglio and others as allies. The second thing, there was no trials for the war crimes in Libya for the Italian fascists as in Italy and the Nuremberg trials. Third, the Allies and the conservative groups in Italy were afraid of the Communist Party, the most populous and organized party in Western Europe, the Italian Communist Party. So there was a cover-up, Lu'ai. There was a cover-up. And when I was invited to give talks after the publication of my book, Forgotten Voices, in the premier universities in the United States, Ivy League universities, Harvard, Berkeley, UCLA, University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, Georgetown, and so I'll ask them, do you know about this case? And everybody say, Professor, was there such a thing? And they were sympathetic and they would really want to know. But I think up until the publication of this book, unfortunately, the fascists and the people who are sympathetic to Italian fascism not only were silent about this cover-up, they propagated the idea that Italian fascism was really modernizing force, putting the Bedouin and the Muslims who are backward and the Arabs who are backward in the 20th century for that matter. And the other thing that's also the final point, and I'll stop here. In 1938, Lu'ai, after Omar Mukhtar was arrested and tried and hanged, and the resistance was defeated, and many, many resistant groups migrated to Tunisia, to Saudi Arabia, to Syria, to Egypt, to Chad, to Niger, thousands of people, because they will be punished by the Italian fascists. The first 20,000 settlers arrived in Libya in 1938. So emptying the land, in other words, exterminating people who are resisting, and cleansing them. And even I said it's genocide because of the criteria for it was achieved. And they began to bring the settlers, and the plan to bring between 50 to 1 million Italian settlers in Libya, similar to the French plan for Algeria earlier between 1830 until independence in the 1962.
So we will definitely circle back even more to the context. You can go back even earlier. But I want to press you a little bit on maybe a slightly more technical question. So think about it this way. When you went to do your research and you went to the Italian archives, how was the experience in terms of the representation of the genocide? Was it hidden? Was it obscured? Were the numbers deliberately tampered with? That's number one, because I remember certain stories where there were apologetic archive, workers who had to tell you, sorry, we can't give you this part of information or that. In addition, how did this particular experience shift the type of research that you had to do? Because if you couldn't rely on Italian and Western archives, how did you kind of solve that dilemma? Like, what kind of approaches did you have to take?
Very pointed questions, Lu'ai. The first one, I started with good faith, good intention, because I was trained to do archives as a political scientist, and I did anthropology, which is oral history. I was very well equipped to handle both. And I have done that since my PhD dissertation in the late 80s and the beginning of the 90s. So I learned Italian at the University of Washington and in Italy earlier. And I decided to go to the archives, which is any serious scholar would do, is to go and see, as you know, in Western countries, after 30 years, most of the archives will be available to scholars. So I decided to go. This is talking about almost 80 years later on. So I decided to go there with a very, very big recommendation from one of my professors and a very, very eminent Italian sociologist whom I met in Seattle. I went there for a week and I asked for the files on the camps, concentration camps. Not only I didn't get any clear answer, they decided to kick me out with a very, very lame excuse. They say you are of Libyan descent. Libya doesn't really allow us to do research in their archives, so we're going to reciprocate and we'll discontinue your research here. I went back. I mean, of course, this kind of research, you have to be patient. You can't just do it a year or 2 years. This is really, you need to have a long patience, paying attention. And when a door is closed to you, don't say this is it. You try to find another way to resolve the issue. So what happened, I went again and I couldn't find much of the files. And I wrote to the most eminent historian. There were a few historians who were out of the mainstream in Italy. Two of them said this, what happened in the camps is a genocide. And I didn't say that. It wasn't me who said that. So what happened, I didn't know that the Italian officials were really ex-colonial fascist officers. They haven't been tried or so. So they really had an interest in not seeing, a younger Libyan scholar coming, or Arab or Muslim scholar trying to snoop around to find about this. That's the first thing. Second thing, this historian said bluntly to me, he said, son, I have stayed here. I have researched these files for 40 years. Don't waste your time here. And I said, why? And he said to me, I think either they removed them or manipulated them. Then I said, oh my goodness, I'm doomed here. What should I do? He said, what do you recommend I should do? I said, if I were you, don't waste your time, because these specific files, well, you are not going to find them. We might find them one day in different place, but right now I will not waste my time. So he recommended to me to go to Barqa, to eastern Libya, and to see if the survivors will talk to me. What did he mean by the survivors? We're talking about the kids, boys and girls who are the age between 5 and 15, and they're still alive. They were interned in these camps between 29 and 34. So that shifted my focus to a point, because I decided to look at American archives if I'll find something there, the Tunisian French archives, the Egyptian archives, and also the Libyan archives in Tripoli. So I went to eastern Libya, Barqa, and because of my grandmother is from eastern Libya, and I have friends there, and so they took me to meet some of these survivors. At the beginning, they were very suspicious, but then they inquired me, who are you? Who are your parents? Who are your grandparents? Who are your a tribe? Where are you from? What are you going to do with this research? And I loved it. And I wrote it, if you remember, in the introduction as well. And it turned to be the most intriguing one, because it's reflective about the ethics of scholars and not to look down at people you interview. So anyway, to make a long story short, after they began to open to me and trust me, I traveled to Libya for 10 years, from 2000 until 2010. And that made a huge difference, because I collected almost 300 interviews, and the Libyan Studies Center gave me all of their interviews. But my questions were more pointed, in the sense I asked them about specifics, their daily life, their food, their clothes. And that's really because I had a really good training in anthropology, which allowed me and became handy when I interviewed them. So that's really the turning point. The archives was destroyed. And by the way, most of the suspicious bloody crimes of colonialism have been destroyed in Kenya, the British in Kenya, the Belgium in the Congo, in many places. So it's not surprising. So I think oral history, which has to be verified and investigated, became an alternative, wonderful, rich source for me. And the poems that were written, which is an Arabic tradition, Shar in Libya, we call it a Shar al-Sha'bi. They compose hundreds and hundreds of poems describing men and women, what happened to them in these camps. And I got all of that. And then after that, I began to sit down and read and ask and educate myself about what does it all mean. The oral history interviews, the American and the French archives, the Arabic archives, the Italian archives later on, where I got all the files to the help of some wonderful Italian researchers, the files of the general who was behind the genocide. And out of it, then after that, I sat down and began to write the book. So this is really a very complex, long journey that took 10 years to figure out alternative sources, what happened in between 29 and 34. The second part, then it became linking, and this is where I think my manuscript is different from Arab academic scholarship. I had a goal. I don't want to just write to us, the Libyans and the Arabs and the Muslims. I want to intervene in the whole modern field and the theory of genocide studies, and specifically the Holocaust studies. And with wonderful mentors like my dear friend Mahmoud Mamdani at Columbia and others, and Noam Chomsky and others, they said you have to finish this because this is the most serious case, not for the Libyan case, but also for understanding that. And after that, I wrote it as an intervention and mediation from a Southern Arab and Muslim perspective in the contemporary Arab, the debate about genocide studies. And to my surprise, only with a few exceptions, Luay, we in the Arab world and the Muslim world have been we made a foolish decision to stay out of it. And even our universities now caught by surprise when Gaza's genocide took place in front of our eyes. There's a lot of pontifications without depth or understanding. This field is very advanced, very, very fundamental to modern scholarship and modern philosophy way of thinking. And we are latecomers. And I hope this book will be an intervention, not only about what happened in Libya and figure out the crime as a legal and a scholar interpretation, but also an intervention from a Southern perspective to see where do we fare with the Congolese, with the Namibians, with the Algerians as Arabs and Muslims in this whole debate on genocide. And I think that, I hope that people will read it, but also don't take it lightly. It's a very hard book. It's not simple story, but very hard book. And the name Shar was something I insisted as the Jews talk about Shoah, the Holocaust. I want the whole world to understand this is an Arab name given by the survivors, by the subaltern themselves, to what they went through.
So just to sum up your research, you had to, it seems at a later point, circle back to some of these Western resource archives, especially Italian ones, even though you were blocked out of them. So you're looking at Western archives. You look at Arabic archives as well as like Arab historians and how they portrayed the Libyan genocide. You also look at oral histories, which you've had to travel for around 10 years to do. And you also look at poetry. Here's a question about oral history and testimonies. Are there specific insights that you may have missed had you just relied on archives? So how important was it to do these oral histories, and how did they compare with the archives in terms of the types of insights that they opened up for you?
Very, very poignant question. We forget that the archives written by a state, by the elite, in this case, the colonial and the fascist state. So they will include what they want to include, and they have a motive behind it. Yes, there's this happened and this happened and this happened. But also there was the language, there is also the criteria for recording what happened. And I think if we want to understand the agency of the people who went through it, we need to be careful, pay attention to it. So to me, the oral history and the poems that was written there is almost not just an oral history. It's an eyewitness and testimonies. I'll give you a comparable example, Luay. We know that 11 million people perished under the Nazi state. 5 to 6 of them were Jews. Some were gassed, some were killed. So the evidence disappeared. But even in the study of the Holocaust, the eyewitness or the testimonies of the survivors is very crucial. I think, unfortunately, anthropology, even though it was born under colonial construction of knowledge and control, in Arab studies, in English, it's still evolving. But in the Arab world, I think anthropology is still an alien, a new field. And oral history, which was, I think in Libya, the Center of Libyan Study did marvelous thing because they invited the father of oral history from University of Wisconsin. His name is John Vancina, who supervised and trained them in the 1970s. And it's really fantastic. But we still yet have to habilitate and find a place for a sophisticated oral interviews, anthropological critical studies that really is not, a quick or gullible, but really try to investigate as any serious matter. And for that reasoning, I think, for me, it was a tremendous experience to be rigorous, to be thorough, to verify the evidence, and also to respect the agencies and testimonies. And these are the people who went through it. So they could tell us about what happened. And as you know, there is a whole horrific chapter where I try to verify what happened in the camps. starvation, diseases, and families were wiped out completely. And that was very hard because I remember, I'll give you the story to illustrate what I'm talking about. I did the research in 3 languages. I did the research in 3 continents. And then at the end, beside the interviews, I decided to go and visit the location of the 5 death camps. I call them the death camps because 80% of the people there were wiped out because of starvation and diseases. And I went with my camera and with my tape recorder and a Libyan driver with me from Benghazi. And we went to Tariya, Suluk, Sidi Hamad al-Magroon, the Brega, and the Agela. Unfortunately, most of them now, the Libyan modern state kind of wiped them out to construction and development. But the 2 are remaining, especially Agela was horrific. And I'll tell you one thing, and I wrote it in the book, Lu'ay. When I went there, I saw the remaining of the camps. And then I looked at the cemeteries and the graves. We call them in Libya Jababin or Qubur. And it was long rows and lines of graves. I literally drove back to Benghazi with the driver, and I was shaken because I saw death face to face. It wasn't something here academic or so. No, you see really the horrors, to use Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, you see the horrors of what happened there. And I got really angry at the Libyan modern state, the monarchy, and the Gaddafi regime and Jamahiriya for talking big, but doing so little to restore and build a museum, construct what happened there. And that's really something, even though I'm a leading scholar on colonial North Africa, I didn't know. And only by going there physically and doing a field work, then I began to see it's not enough to just do the archives. It's not enough to do the oral interviews. It's also important to do field work. And the memory, by the way, is not something happened in the past where, people are historian in one level, political scientists and economists and sociologists. No, that's silly. We need all those fields to interact with each other, and we need to understand the history of the present, because whether we like it or not, we're still debating and trying to understand, and every generation try to have a new way of thinking about it. But in this case, it was heartbreaking, but I have to be patient and I have to have a long-term endurance. So I will figure out what happened, just what happened. And then after that, what does it mean, Lu'ay? What does it mean theoretically and historically and also culturally today? And that's why this book was more than an academic book. For me, it's really a way of revealing the complexity of what happened and also relying on my problematic in the book. If you notice in the book, I focus on 2 themes, remembrance and silence. Why certain cases are silenced and how they are silenced and how people remember history. In this case, a big crime like dying collectively in big concentration camps.
So, in addition to the field work and the oral history, we've talked about this, but I want to dive into it a little bit more. You highlight the importance of poetry in Libyan society, and that might surprise some of the listeners, especially in a case like this. So, why did poetry become such a central way to express and preserve the trauma of this genocide? And as you go through, please feel free to perhaps recite some of the important ones that you remember or ones that are perhaps central to the genocide?
Yes, I grew up in Libya as a youngster and I left after high school, but still I said at the beginning of the book, my modern education in Libya and in Egypt and in America prepared me to a degree to understand the archives and the larger picture. But really what helped me understand the culture of the intern people in these collective prisons and camps was my mother and my grandmother. Both were illiterate and didn't go to school. And I'll give you an example. My late mother, who died 20 years ago almost, when me and my sisters and my brothers ask her a question, she doesn't answer us directly. She either recite the beginning of a poem or proverb. And then we will began to talk to Esther. What did she mean by that? Then when I began to look at what kind of Arabic language, what kind of dialect, what kind of proverbs, what kind of poetry. My mother, when we were ill, when you say, I'm ill, mother, I remember her very, very vivid. She would recite the most important epic poem from the Agela camp by this brilliant, Shar poet called Rajab Buhwaysh al-Manifi, around a long, long poem. He was interned there, and he was a faqih and a poet, and he hunted the silence on the camps. The famous poem called Ma bi Marad. So my mother will tell her, oh, mother, I'm really ill. I'm ill. She said, Ma bi marad ghair dar al-agila. Means that your illness is nothing in comparison with the poem there. And then years come, decades later, and I said, my mother was sending us a message. And only if to understand the background, that orality, and people recite their stories that are not recorded in books and archives in the press, that can really make sense. We just need to be patient without romanticizing it and pay attention, because almost there is a culture within a culture, Lu'ay. There is a culture within a culture, and we are very diverse, vibrant societies, not only in Libya and the whole region. I mean, there is a lot of layers that we need to kind of figure out and see how the people negotiate different kind of cultures. So what's the gist of the story? Then I began to pay attention. What is this poem? University of Benghazi published this, collected all that oral history, and they gave it to me. Friends gave it to me. And I'll just give you here this poem, just give you the gist of what I'm talking about. Because, for example, he says in Arabic, this poet in the Agela camp say, Ma bi marad ghair dar al-Agela. I have no illness but this place of Agela. The imprisonment of my tribe and the separation from my kin abode. No illness but endless grief, meager provisions, and the loss of my black-red spotted steed. And he began to continue and continue whipping our women, seeing my beloved one dead. And this epic poem, Lu'ay, was translated by a dear friend of mine at University of Michigan, the Libyan American poet Khalid Mutawa, and it's there. And also other epic poems. So then I began to pay attention. So the intern, and the survivors, their children who survived the camps, they actually expressed themselves through orality by repeating their stories. Second, they culturally composed shi'r nabati, or shi'r, as we say in Libya, shi'r sha'bi. This is the way of mode of communication. Now, it doesn't exist in all parts of Libya, but its literacy and orality and a poetic imagination was part of everyday kind of communication. And then I began to pay attention. Where are the poems that were written in the camps during imprisonment? What kind of meter? What kind of vocabulary? What kind of metaphors? What they are telling us? And to my pleasant surprise, I found hundreds of them. So that became very important. Of course, you have to be careful. You have to be literate. And I spent almost a year and a half trying to understand the meter, the Arabic, that particular lahja or dialect of Libya, and also to understand the metaphor. And some words I didn't understand, I have to ask, and I have dictionaries and books. And I educated myself on that so I could understand how they express themselves. And that paid off, because now these poems are translated into English and the whole world can read them. So the fascist Lu'ay managed to censor, erase that horrible crime for 80, 90 years. And the people who really took that thing and were silent enabled it to happen. Because in modern scholarship now, up before this book, it wasn't even there. Also, the important thing, you would be shocked to this day, the Italian education system in college and before college, and the press and everything, you'll find voices outside here and there, but the whole socialization and education is indifferent and have few pages. I read all the texts in a big college text, Italian text in Italian, and you'll find a page or half a page, and they say, we tried to modernize those natives, but we didn't succeed, and they move on. So there is a complexity, and also there is a propaganda of silence, if you like, that Italian fascism was benign, or lesser evil, was not as violent and genocidal as the Nazi German type. And this idea is so pervasive in modern Western scholarship beyond, our expectations. And this is where I want to debunk that myth and engage it in a different way. And I think the next follow-up to this book, I'm examining the connection between the Nazi genocide and the Italian one. Keep in mind, what I try to do is something very, very important. I wanted to challenge the whole modern social science and academic division of labor. There is European studies, there is Arab studies, there's Middle Eastern studies, there is African studies, as if they have no connection. But, in my book, when you break those artificial barrier, ideological, epistemological barriers, and you began to look at the Congo, Namibia, Aljazair, and Libya, and Europe, a new dimension will emerge. And the whole idea that the Holocaust is unique and exceptional and in 20th century is false.
Really interesting to me how your mother was essentially relaying information about the genocide in daily life through the use of poetry, and you didn't really recognize this until much later when you were doing your research. I want to build a little bit on this portrayal of Italian fascism as being more moderate than German Nazism, right? Because where does this perception come from? How did it contribute to the marginalization of the Libyan genocide? Would you mind giving us also some examples of how this myth was propagated in Western media, movies, academic and intellectual circles?
Yeah, well, if you look at Hollywood most popular films like Tea with Mussolini, about British older ladies having tea with Mussolini, and the romance of Italy, tourism, good cuisine, wonderful country that we all admire and we should admire in so many ways. But also the idea that Italians are really brutal colonizers and fascists and committed act of genocide. That's really alien there. I'll give you another example. My favorite Western German American philosopher, Hannah Arendt. I was trained as a theorist and a comparativist, and she's almost like a goddess in our American social sciences. She was very astute in seeing the connection between colonial genocides and the Holocaust. But in her book, the most famous book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the trial in Jerusalem in 1961, because she is influential, that became really unbelievable, big error. Big blind spot, I call it, blind spot. She said there was no Jewish question in Italy. Only in 1938, with the Italian, when the Germans pressured Mussolini, it became an issue. And my goodness, she didn't. I tried to excuse her. She didn't know about the Libyan case, and also I think the Italian fascists succeeded in really censoring and covering that up. But that eminent philosopher and political theorist, Lu'ay, became, nobody could challenge Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt wrote the most theoretical explanation of the Holocaust and modernity. And the third example I'm going to share with you, when I looked at American society, I tried to do something very, I think was very wise. I looked at the archives of the Italian American state and how they viewed fascism and colonialism. And then I looked at public institutions. I looked at the New York Times coverage of the genocide and the camps. I looked at a popular magazine called National Geographic magazine. And I looked at some of social sciences, political science analysis of Italian fascism. And what I discovered is horrifying endorsement or indifference to what happened, with the exception of few voices, like one officer in the American embassy in Rome who said, this is really horrific. There's something horrific going on. The President FDR and his administration, actually, they liked Italian fascism. And then in the society, National Geographic magazine had 4 or 5 articles when journalists went to Libya, Italian Libya. They praised it as a modernization. And third, the New York Times was full of shame. They also went along with that. And finally, to probably that shouldn't surprise you, some political scientists like this guy, his name is McGruger at UC Berkeley, supposed to be a basin of liberal social science, viewed fascism as developmentalism, as modernization. So that I didn't try to just jump to conclusion, oh, this happened, how could that happen? No, I tried to investigate. And no wonder people, they can think of this crime. No wonder people haven't really knew about this case, because they covered it and they censored it. And alternatively, they propagated this really flawed, bogus argument that Italian fascism was benign, was lesser evil, and did not commit acts of genocide and violence.
So it's when you look at it, it isn't just kind of gentle perceptions of Italy that you see in movies like Captain Corelli's Mandolin or Mediterraneano,
Yes.
which you mentioned both. And
Yes.
some political scientists who aren't necessarily sympathetic. There's also open sympathy, and you mentioned even Ford as one of the
Yes.
potential sympathizers,
And
as
Ezra
well
Bowen, the famous poet.
yeah, and Charles Lindbergh. So it was it's quite
yes.
a wide array of people.
That's why it will really yes.
Yeah.
This discovery will annoy and also shock a lot of people, because if you are an American student or so, no wonder you're going to be brainwashed, because this is what presented to you.
So I want to dive into the genocide a bit more. I mean, I know we talked about it earlier, the historical context, but I want to go back just a little bit earlier to because it happens in the context of the Italian invasion of Libya, which starts in 1911, and then the resistance follows, and that's kind of what sets the context. Could you walk us through the context? I want you to especially focus on the role of the Cyrenaica movement in Libyan society and how it organized resistance, because that's really kind of like the heart of where everything starts, right? The entire story.
Yes, it's no secret that the Italians were surprised to have this organized resistance by groups who are very marginal, very supposed to be backward and were not able, but also that they welcome modern army that probably will really change their lives. So at best, they might resist a little bit, but they will accept them. What happened is we need to take a break from that perspective. It's not surprising. The Italian, like the French and the others, they always show themselves and justify their colonial conquest based on the burden of the white man, civilizing mission, breathing of superior, modern, equipped and societies and races. And as Hannah Arendt, colonialism invented two institutions, race and bureaucracy, before even Europe, for that matter. So here, what happened before the conquest in early October 1911, the province of Torablus al-Gharb, and sometimes Barqa, was independent, mutasarrifiyya in that sense. But overall, Libya was, as a name, was revived by Italian later on. So what happened in the second half of the 19th century, the Ottomans had the garrisons and a few schools by late 19th century. In Benghazi, in Derna, in Tripoli, in Al-Khums, and a small garrison in southern Libya. They always let the communities rule themselves, and they didn't have the resources to, unless they collect taxes. So there was a lot of self-governing. There are two things that were important. The Ottomans began to, late 19th century, in the 70s, tanzimat, or reforms, the Ottoman reforms. They began to crush the independent confederations. They introduced a land reform, registration of land. They introduced some schools. They began to build bureaucracy. And in Western Libya, that's what we call Al-Gharb or Tripolitania, they managed to create a new structure of a proto-state or Ottoman modernization. In Eastern Libya and Southern Libya, they were left alone. And in middle of 19th century, a scholar by the name, Algerian scholar by the name of Muhammad bin Ali al-Sanusi, probably one of the most learned scholars of the 19th century. He followed his Moroccan teacher. He studied in Algiers, studied at Al-Qarawiyyin in Fas, and then he went to Al-Azhar a little bit and studied with him in Saudi Arabia, and then followed him to Yemen, there too. And there are many followers of him. They were not really racially oriented. This is pan-Islamic movement. And this remarkable scholar and Sufi, called for reopening the gate of Ijtihad. He had a project in his mind, and he couldn't go back to Algeria. So he decided to settle in a place of the larger Maghreb, or Libya, where there was no strict Ottoman control or European control. So Algeria was colonized. Morocco had a stronger state, local state, the Alawi state. Tunisia was colonized in 1881, and he couldn't settle there. So he made a good choice by settling in eastern Libya and Barqa. And this remarkable, brilliant scholar, whom I rediscovered, I even called my father and I said, he's very brilliant. And he said, my father, who was a very learned teacher, he said, Ali had to go to America to discover that this guy was a brilliant. This is silly of you. So anyway, what he did, I'll make a shorter summary of his accomplishment. He settled in eastern Libya and began to focus on two institutions. Education, by building zawayas, which is a North African institute. It's almost like masjid, but masjid that's also not only for praying, and it's a school for teaching, and also a place for travelers, for trade, for crafts, for other things. And he focused on education and also on self-reliance and the economic trade. His vision was, before we face European colonialism, we need to build our own education, our own people, and make them really resilient, and not just a matter of carrying arms. And I thought he was really brilliant in that vision. He built these institutions, and his followers came from all over the Muslim world, from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, from Tunisia, from Algeria, from Yemen, from Sudan, and from Chad. And they established the higher institute in Jarboub, outside of the state. What happened at the end, and these zawayas were in Western, in Hijaz, in Egypt, Western Desert Egypt, in Libya, and also in Chad, and also southern Tunisia. By the time the Italian came, this is really the larger point, they faced a very, very clear leadership in Western Libya, who established a republic, the first republic in the Arab world, called the Britannian Republic, Al-Jamhuriyya Trablusiyya, and the Italian crushed it after 2 years. In Eastern and Southern Libya, the Senusiyya social movement, cultivating and investing in institution and education and trade and self-reliance, created the most cohesive society, not based on tribal affiliation or ethnic affiliation or racial affiliation, but on pan-Islamic social movement. And Umar al-Mukhtar and other leaders were trained and educated in these institutions. So when the Italian came, they faced very well-organized indigenous societies. And that allowed them to resist a modern army until 1931. This is really the larger meaning. I am not really interested in heroic history. We need to explain it to ourselves and to the world. What allowed people to organize, how they were organized, how they were able to create not only skilled fighters, but also people who believe in their cause. And that's what happened. And the legacy of the Senusiyya and the Tripolitan Republic were really along and everlasting, because they created the whole idea of awareness of Libya as a nation, and Libya as a homeland later on after independence.
So the Senusiyya essentially sets the anti-colonial context that is, I guess the mindset, even as the organization of society, down to even the economic level, that allows the eastern and southern part of Libya to resist the Italians. And the resistance, I don't know if you would describe it as successful, but it basically slows down the Italians up until the 1920s, when things really changed dramatically, because you describe a pacification campaign led by two generals, General Badoglio and General Graziani. So tell me what changed during this period. How did this particular campaign really shift the power dynamics and essentially set off the beginnings of the genocide in Eastern Libya?
Well, what happened is, because there was very well organized discipline, and in some cases brilliant leaders like Omar al-Mukhtar, Yusuf Burahil, Fadil Ammar, these people who were also strategically very, very brilliant. They hit and run, and they also modest in many ways, and their food was very, very limited, and they know the terrain. But I think they were preparing for it. What I discovered, knowing what happened in Algeria and what happened in Tunisia near them, and they are in touch as a students and as traveling to Egypt, they were aware that the European Italian state, they called it Napolitano, they're going to come to them. So they were really expecting that. And in fairness, the Ottoman officers, many of them fought with them and they refused to sell them out as the state in 1912. So many of them fought and they came back in 1915 as well. So what you have here is a long organized resistance culminating in 1915 in defeating the Italian armies in the Battle of Cordoba, which the Italian sources called the Battle of Qasr Buhadi near Sirte. The three resistance allied and some of the Banda that fought with the Italian turned against the Italian army, and it was a horrific defeat for the Italian armies. And Colonel Miani, the head of the Italian army, career was over and he was disgraced. And they controlled most of the interior until the fascists came in 1922. The Italian fascists wanted to no agreement with the Tripolitan Republic. Also, they want to dismiss the agreement with the Senussia Emirates in eastern Libya and southern Libya. And they began to say, we want Libya as ours, as our foreshore. And that led to bringing the most sophisticated arms. And needless to say, and to remind your listeners, the first use of airplanes in war was in Libya. The first time, period, in history. Of course, it was very primitive. They go and the pilots throw bombs on the armies. And they did horrific things because in the oral history I collected, when they were drawing a woman and women trying to escape from the Italian armies, they would attack them and they're, viciously and that. So what really emerged out of it, a very well-organized resistance that lasted from 1911 in a different period and resumed after 1922. The Italian at the end, managed because of their airplanes, because their cannons, and they began to really bribe some leaders and so to eventually defeat the resistance with the capture and the trial and the hanging of the heroic leader Omar al-Mukhtar. But at the same time, who said that's really the only way to look at it? Because what happened, because this resistance continued for 20 years, as you said, it's deterred, slowed as humanly possible with the resources they have, this assault on colonial assault. And I think even though the Italian had the headway in the 30s, controlled Libya, and only in 1943, the Allies, when they defeated the fascists, they were kicked out. But that resistance created, in my opinion, I argue, the awareness of Libya as an entity, national consciousness, and the Libyans, fighters, freedom fighters that time fought not as just Libyans. When I asked them, why did you fight a modern army? They kept saying to me the following: we fought for God, for Allah, homeland, al-Watan, which means, different Watan, and our clan, our families. So they were very specific, but at the same time, there is no household in most of Libya who will not tell you stories like my grandparents and my mother and so. So this became really when, for the younger generations who gained independence, we were born after independence, generation of independence, and Libya was devastated. The Italian settlers were increasing. They took most of the land in eastern Libya and western Libya. They also not only took most of the land and brought settlers there, they also began to introduce education. And the fascists for the natives only to 6th grade because they want them to be a second, do other jobs. Third was all important. When Libya became independent in 1951, there were only 15 university graduates because most of the educated elite under the Ottoman rules and who were educated in various institutions inside Libya or in Egypt or in Tunisia, were either went to exile or killed. And also the last point I want to share with you, which is probably will shock your listeners. Most Arabs and Muslims and also they think that the Algerian War of Independence cost 1 million to 1.5 million people. The population of Libya was, some estimates, half of it perished directly or indirectly between 1911 and 1943. At least in my estimate, the most maybe concrete minimal example, 300,000 of them perished. So Tunisia, if we compare Tunisia and Libya between 1900 and 1951, Tunisia have a 2.5 million, while Libya had 1 million, almost 800. But both of them had around 1 million in 1900. That horrific record of extermination and annihilation of the population, unfortunately, is not very well known. And it took me that long to document in this book. But also, as they say in English, you better come late than ever. And I'll tell you, Alu, I never in my wildest imagination, I expected these things, especially in the camps, genocide, because I didn't know that was even a genocide. But then after I studied it and look at the 2 Italian courageous scholars who told me it's a genocide, unpublished that, I applied the criteria invented and created by the modern founder of genocide studies, a Polish Jewish scholar by the name of Raphael Lemkin, who escaped Nazism, and codified that in the 1948 UN conference in Paris. He said, to have a genocide, you have to have 3 conditions. 1, intentionality. 2nd, you have to destroy the patterns of life, economic, biological, economic, social, what have you. And in this case, of course, killing and confiscating or starving 500,000 animals also added to the starvation in the case of Libya. And 3rd, you replace it by the dominant country's social, economic, demographic patterns. And I found letters by Italian fascist generals who said exactly, we don't care. Now, some Israeli leaders, generals, and even soldiers, they say the Palestinians are not humans. And for our security, if we kill their children and women, or so be it, bluntly. And that's what really the case when I looked at the archival evidence. Then I began to say, no, the name genocide is appropriate. The name of Shar should be studied and recognized, even though it took 90 years, 80 years of silence and marginalization.
So, just to build on that point, there's a chilling quote that you include from General Badoglio. It's very explicit about creating a separation between the rebels and the civilian population. I'm going to read it if you don't mind. We must, above all, create a large and well-defined territorial gap between the rebels and the subject population. I do not conceal from myself the significance and the gravity of this action, which may well spell the ruin of the so-called subject population. So essentially, it wasn't coincidental. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew it could lead to mass deaths, and they still didn't care. Now, this policy led to forced marches, mass deportations, and concentration camps. I think you mentioned about 5, if I'm not mistaken, or you talk about 5 concentration camps. Could you help us understand what this looked like on the ground from the perspective of people who experienced it, these concentration camps, just so people could get like a sense of, what life was like and what the main cause of the deaths was in these?
Well, first of all, the deportation, the record that I discovered, the deportation in Italian, and also what the eyewitnesses the survivors described, they say it was horrific. They didn't give them much time. They marched them from as far as the Egyptian borders to some ports, and also sometimes on foot for almost 350 to 400 miles with their herds and their tents and their food. And anybody who will get sick or couldn't walk, the soldiers, especially the askaris, the colonial soldiers, had orders to shoot them. We discovered that some people died, and some died in these really horrible ships, in the dungeon of those ships. And when they died, they throw them at sea. They told me in their oral history, at sea. And then when they arrived these camps, especially the 5 one I mentioned, they said, one woman told me that we didn't need to be fed. We are self-reliance. We have our animals, we have our fields, but the devastation, first of all, the confiscation of some of these animals, and many of these animals starved to death as the survivors themselves. So they didn't have access to food. That's the first thing. The second thing, consistently, they said they did not feed us. They only give us some barley, and very debased barley to us. So malnutrition led to starvation after the first year, especially for the elderly, the children, and the ill and the sick ones. Third, which is also revealing to me because that explains why so many thousand of them died, almost kind of 2/3 of them died in these camps in 4 years or 5 years. They said they didn't give us any medicine. And I think the idea that if we want to starve them, we don't want to treat them, especially the one who was associated with the resistance in these 5 camps, became obvious that they want to kill them, especially if you keep in mind 2 things. First, Luay, in 1938, the first 20,000 Italian settlers were brought to Libya, and they took some of the land, not only in Western Libya, and the people who were deported from Eastern Libya. Now, it's true, 90% of the people in these camps were from Eastern Libya, not in Western Libya. There was only, I found another camp in the 40s of Libyan Jews who collaborated with the Allies in the camp of Jado in the Western Jabal Nufusa in Western Libya. But most of the deaths came from, we discovered also in the archives that there were some people who were brought from Southern Libya in these camps, around 10% later on for various reasons. Either were accused of killing Italian officers or sabotaging them or so. So what you see is mass killing via starvation and imposed diseases and illnesses that were not treated. And the stories that I comment and tell really speak for themselves because I really verified those stories very well. And I even tell the story in one example where this elderly person was sitting there and there were ants going through his arm. So this young boy who survived, he said, I tried to remove the ants, and he said, don't do that, boy. And apparently the ants were collecting grain from the garbage, and he wanted to eat those pieces of grain from the ants. The other example, which really horrific, is there was this woman who was tied to the pole. And she has, this boy said, I came to check on her. There was one young boy clinging to his mother and a baby on her chest. And imagine a Muslim Arab woman, conservative society. She asked him, please squeeze my breast so that the baby will not starve. So he did it. And both, I can see how awkward that was. But here, these are not silly or funny stories. These are people who are on the verge of genocide.
There's countless stories that are pretty like a harrowing experience, pretty horrific to read in the book.
Yes. And I'm sorry for it because my children said, no more genocide studies. Next book should be about a light topic.
But we have to, the world has to know, the world has to understand, especially with what's happening today in Gaza. I mean, it's all even more timely, I think.
It's very, very much interrelated. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to try to kind of conclude with 2 questions. First one is, you see later on in the history of Libya attempts to try to get, to address this genocide by Libyan authorities. The monarchy makes some attempt, but then it says we aren't strong enough, we're not ready to confront the Italians about this. And later on, you see the genocide come to the forefront with Muammar Gaddafi's regime, where it becomes a talking point, right? Omar al-Mukhtar,
Yes.
resistance, all these things. So to what extent do you think that Libyan authorities were actually serious in addressing this genocide as opposed to just simply using it for their own purposes? And the second part of the question is, the younger generation in Libya, does it understand this genocide? Does it relate to it? Because I remember distinctly that the symbols of resistance to colonialism were actually used in the 2011 revolution against Gaddafi.
Yes. A very important question. Let me ask the last one first, and then I'll address the other one. I tried to raise the same question, Luay, I said, I want to see how much written on the subject matter. And I found only one master thesis. And bless his soul, he just passed away 3 days ago. A historian by the name of Yusuf al-Barghati. That's the only major book in the subject. And then I said to myself, I wonder, the same question you're asking me now. And I said, how do Libyan youth know much about the subject matter? Because I want to see how intergenerational, cross-generational memory of history continues or not, or ruptured. And so I came with a very, I think, practical plan. I asked the students, without making very fancy survey, your name, where you're from, what institution you are in, and whether you heard of the camps before, the concentration camps, al-Mu'taqalat, or that's the name of it in Libya, or al-Shibardak, as the survivors said, and where did you learn about it, and what stories that's lasted with you? So very, very pointed, very, very non-commonsensical questions. And do you have anybody who was your family or related to you who were interned there, or related to the concentration camps experience? And I sent it to colleagues in Libya, in Eastern Libya, in Central Libya, and Western Libya, and also Southern Libya, where I grew up. And my colleagues were very, very fantastic. They passed it to their students. I have almost 700 answers. I can't do it now because I think they rather go to Facebook than answering something like that. And the finding was fascinating. And I asked the students, be as honest as possible. It's not, I would like to know. Now, in Western Libya, they didn't know much. They were angry. They say they didn't teach us anything. Damn them. Some of students, they were angry at the state and the educational policy, and so they didn't teach us. And most of them said Omar al-Mukhtar, like most Arabs, they remember that film, the good film that was produced and really portrayed by the late Mustafa al-Aqad. In Eastern Libya, it's funny, they said we were educated at home by our grandparents and grandmothers, and our parents who were told by their parents. So it's not the school that taught them. It's the homes, the family educational background, and the oral stories that my mother used to share with us when I was young and growing up in Libya.
Sorry to interrupt, but just so it's clear to the reader, this survey that you're talking about, was this during Muammar al-Gaddafi's period or after the revolution?
Yes. I passed that in 2007, 2008, under Gaddafi's government, the Jamahiriya government.
Yeah, that's very, very useful context for people to know that even though Gaddafi himself really would mention Omar al-Mukhtar, would double down and use these symbols.
Yes.
It really wasn't taught in schools, at least according to the answers.
So precisely. I think that's a good question for the listener to know. I did that very late. So, and that's the whole idea, because the book, I started in 2000. And after I did all of that, I wanted to see the multiple layers, the American reactions, the Libyan reaction. So the research is not just linear, one area without the other. It's almost cross-cultural, cross-generational way of thinking about it. And that's why I think the book took a very long time to finish, because it was a complex one. So in Southern Libya, the finding was interesting. Some, they were taught by their parents or grandparents. But the revealing, a new discovery for me, they said our teachers in Southern Libya were more keen in teaching the Mu'taqalat experience. So the teachers, in a hidden way, in Southern Libya played a role. And the students kept repeating it, that we studied that. Now, as far as the first part of your question, how did the independent Libyan states reacted to this horrible experience about al-Mu'taqalat, or the concentration camps? I started with an open attitude. I didn't have any conclusion. So I said, how did the monarchy and the independent elite or the independence elite teach this or reacted to this? And it's very interesting. I think they made a choice. I fully understand why they made that choice. They said we really came from the most devastating colonial experience. Thousands of our people were killed. Thousands were pushed into exile. Our country was destroyed by the World War II. We really need to bring people together, and we're going to focus on two things: educating our children and rebuilding Libya. So while I fully understand it, that way of thinking, they negotiated with the Italian. And I looked at the archives, the Arabic and the Italian archives. They were very light. They were intimidated by the Italian, who said, no way, we are not going to pay you anything. And they gave them a nominal compensation. It's really, laughable. I understand why the elite of the Libyan monarchy did what they did, because they really have more urgent way of rebuilding a country that's one of the poorest in the whole world with $35 per capita income. I mean, Libya was really poor and destroyed, and people are exhausted and devastated. So they focused on education and they focused on building the country. But at the same time, there is no escape, Lu'ay, that they dodged the question and the responsibilities. And maybe one could say, in fairness to them, they weren't able that time. They just having Libyan independence in 1951 because of the Allies' support and the very wise leadership of Amir Muhammad Idris al-Sanusi and Sayyid Bashir al-Sa'dawi and the Libyan exiled movement that kept the case alive. It was an achievement in itself. When Gaddafi came to power with the young officers, pan-Arab, pan-Islamist officers, they came with vengeance. And one can understand their anger because Gaddafi at the time, remember Dagela. Nobody gave a damn about you. Nobody remembered you. And it's time that we give our people that. And people thought that he has a good point. What shocked me, I thought maybe this regime's anger is justified, and many Libyans could relate to it before it became really brutal dictatorship and hero worshiping. Then in the 80s and in the 90s, it became a tool to justify the anti-colonial resistance as a way of branding any opposition, justifying any repression in the name of we are fighting the modern day colonialism and we're fighting for Libyan independence. And it was a very cheap way. It was a brutal, real politics way for that. And the evidence for what I am saying, I couldn't find many studies aside from the remarkable achievement of the Libyan Studies Center in collecting oral history. But I found most of those horrible camps being kind of demolished, and they were not even reconstructed or restored. Even the treaty, which is remarkable, even the Algerian couldn't achieve it in negotiating with Berlusconi in 2008 and having an apology. It was a vague apology to the Libyan people and the crimes against the Libyan people. But this was a deal. I'll give you symbolic vague recognition. In exchange, Gaddafi gave them all kind of contracts and investment inside the country. I will not say it was not an important step forward. It was, but also the reality, the record was very, very, modest, and they are responsible for ignoring one of the most horrific crimes. And second, they did not pursue a serious demands for trials, for archival records, for recognizing the survivors, for rebuilding the camps.
Dr. Ahmida, it was a pleasure to have you on here. We're going to conclude by perhaps a quick kind of question. Could you briefly maybe tell us what kind of lessons we can draw from the Libyan genocide, in particular, in terms of how violence is justified, ignored, obscured, to better understand the role of Western complicity in contemporary conflicts? And I'm specifically here talking about the genocide in Gaza.
Well, Lu'ay, this has been a terrific conversation with you. You asked me very pointed and really excellent questions. And I think there are multiple reasons why we should care about the study of war crimes and genocides of the past. First, we want to know the truth about what happened. Second, we want to give respect to the memory of the victims who nobody really gave their humanity and agency any case. Third is, unless we really acknowledge that these memories and these stories could have been eradicated, and the dominant and the oppressor and unjust fabrication of power and knowledge will continue. And I think if we want to look for real healing within Libya and between the Arab world, in this case, Libya and Algeria for that matter, and the Palestinians now, we need to kind of speak truth to power. And it's never too late to do that. Now, it's funny that we talk about this book. I wrote it not as a scholarly book. I mean, it was a scholarly book, but I wanted to give homage and a voice to the people who were supposed to have no history, no agency, and they are just footnote in the history of European colonialism and oppression and war crimes. And also, it's very, very important to me to insist that if you want to have a healing and coexistence, these crimes have to be confronted on the air and have to be debated and talked about. And I always argued that it's not just about the Arab world and Libya in this case. It's about both Europe. I make no hesitation in saying the goal should be rethinking European culture, Italian culture, British culture, German culture. And whether we like it or not, we are involved and interconnected with Europe and America for that matter, Lu'ay. And I think our academic institutions, our curriculum, our epistemology need to really revamp, because we cannot understand ourselves without understanding Europe and America, and vice versa for that matter. That's very where I'm going really for a big punch here, to hide behind objectivity and neutrality. And this is really, you could do that, but that's really escaping and evading the larger ethical and human questions. But it's no mistake that, genocide is still with us. And what happened in the front of our eyes in the case of the Palestinian people in Gaza is really repeats something, a pattern that happened earlier. And therefore, genocide is not over, and we need to kind of learn and catch up, because our universities, in that sense, in the Arab world, need to, recover and have the courage to admit that we have ignored this question for a long time. We paid big price, and we don't know what the hell is genocide studies all about. And now is an opportunity for us, through this book and hopefully future books, that we learn, we teach, we deepen. And instead of the idea of everybody want to comment about genocide on Gaza in a silly, superficial way, really angers me, because we have a lot of catch up to do in general. And that's why I'm delighted that you guys paid attention. You read the book, and gave me an opportunity to talk to your listeners. This book is not the last word, but it's a turning point. I hope that will lead to debates, to thinking, to new studies, and new reading. And it's now also available in Arabic. It was published in 2022. And there are some colleagues in Italy that are translated into Italian, which would be a turning point, because I think the Italian elite, they want me to disappear from the face of earth, because this book is really causing a lot of trouble. The only good news, I'll end by saying that to this very rich conversation with you, the book is causing a big uproar worldwide. I still get invitation from everywhere, from Germany, from Italy, from Holland, from even faraway places. And people write to me about it everywhere. And I'm delighted, because finally, those poor people who fought colonialism, their agency and their pain and their repressed hidden history will no longer be hidden, but will be part of the larger struggle for decency, humanity, and justice.
Dr. Ali Ahmida, it was an absolute pleasure and honor to have you on, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Lu'ay. That was a terrific conversation. I enjoyed it very much. And good luck to you, and stay warm in Richmond.